what politician has ever, in any serious and consistent way, even brought up the Federal Reserve. Even made it like something that they talk about a lot.
Yeah, it had a short moment at the Republican primary debates, but that faded real quick.
Which debates? 2016?
Yeah, both Trump and Cruz were talking about...
Yes, they both talked about auditing the Federal Reserve. And I got to say, that is... And I think all of the credit on that goes to Ron Paul. He is the guy who got people talking about that. Yes, it had a moment where it was brought up. But just given, no matter how you feel about the Fed, it seems like there would be no way to justify it not being something that is discussed a lot.
Yeah.
You know, like no matter what you think, because either way, they're like, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, their job is incredibly crucial. Nobody could argue that.
That's the great thing about money, is that it's kind of complicated and confusing, and they want it that way. They want it to be one of these things where it seems so unapproachable. We just assume, hey, it's on autopilot. It's good.
Yeah. There was always one thing that really, when I first got into the libertarian world and reading Rothbard and Ron Paul and Tom Woods and Peter Schiff and guys like that, one thing that really always stuck with me, and this is just such a, this is not an academic way of looking at things. It's just like as a regular guy, what really always like kind of blew my mind was that you go like, so everybody because we live in this inflationary system, and you know, like people, again, there's a million problems with measuring inflation by the CPI or by prices in general. The Austrian economists would say that the creation of money and credit is inflation in itself. It's not about prices, because you know, whatever, we've said this before, but there could be a big crash in the economy and prices were about to, or not just a crash, it could be for good reasons. There could be some advance in technology where we're going to be, you know, whatever, we have a new machine that can produce twice as much and it's way better, and prices, it's going to cost half as much to get this thing than it used to cost, whatever it is, you know? Like say you're picking apples by hand and then you invent a machine that picks apples, and now all of a sudden apples are way cheaper because it's way easier to pick them. And you could print a ton of money, and then instead of prices falling by 50%, they stay level. And the modern economist would say there's no inflation because the CPI is exactly the same.
What a fucking ass.
By the way, apples aren't included in the CPI,
no, but
you get my point. That the prices would be exactly the same, but there would still be this huge inflation. You're just not accounting for it because prices were about to dip.
I remember seeing articles like a year ago that they were saying that a large part of the reason why they haven't tracked inflation, according to that model, is because of the growth of Amazon and internet sales, and we didn't quite register just how much cheaper goods are because of technology, shipping, and, you know, China just producing cheap shit.
But again, this is that goes right
exactly
to the same point.
Saying,
yes, it's inherently flawed to measure inflation by prices. But even if you do measure inflation the way most mainstream economists today do, which is through prices and specifically through the CPI, which is another level of being fucked up because it's this like basket of goods.
But just to go a little further with that, it's not just that it's flawed, it's actually dangerous because you can have you have asset bubbles that go unrecognized. So I think for the moment where the inflation exists, or at least where they were saying a couple of years ago, I don't follow this as much, but they were saying it was on the bank balance sheets, that when the government gave all the money to the banks, they were basically able to cover for all those shit assets that were on the balance sheets.
Yeah.
And so that's where the inflation is, which means that once they start really, I guess, unloading those assets or loaning more, then boom, you just have inflation in the economy.
Well, yes,
so it exists.
Theoretically, that could happen at any time, and I'm not sure that it will or won't, but you're absolutely right that in theory that could happen.
So you print it, you make it, it's hiding, like if you're just looking at it from the price index standpoint.
But even beyond that, if you just measure it by inflation by prices, and even if you just measure it by the CPI, what you have is that if you have 2%, 3%, 4% inflation, most mainstream economists will be like, well, inflation's not out of control. That's fine. We just accept that 4% of the value of your money is being stolen every year. Of course, that means that over 10 years, 40% of the value of your dollar has been stolen. But what I was talking about, just as a regular guy just getting into this stuff, I always thought it was interesting that we all just accept, without even really putting much thought into it, that we live in an inflationary society. I mean, the old thing about you're like, that your grandmother will be like, oh, when I was a kid, a hot dog cost a nickel and now a hot dog costs $3 or whatever. You just go, well, yeah, that's how an economy works, right? I mean, that's how things work. They get more expensive over time. And we all just take that as a given, and no one really ever scrutinizes that. Well, why is that? Why should things cost more in 2019 than they did in 1956? You know what I mean? Why is that? Why would all these prices be going up? And then when I started reading Rothbard and people like this, and you realize that so in the year 1900, it would have been the opposite. If your grandmother was telling you about what something cost, she would have been like, this was so expensive back in my day, and now it's really, really cheap. And that just stuck with me. I just go, oh, that's so weird, because I just take it for granted that that's how things work. Things get more expensive over time. But it wasn't happening that way through a large period of time. And actually, if you're improving technology and you're improving the way we produce things, it would make sense that the price would drop, that things would get cheaper. I mean, if you used to do something by hand and now you have a machine doing it, it would make sense that this would be way cheaper to get. So absent an inflationary monetary policy, if you have an advancing economy with advancing technology, what you're going to see just by the nature of it is lower and lower prices. Now, in today's day and age, everybody is super concerned with deflation as if this is a bad thing, but really think it through. Now, I get it. If you have a 401k or something like that, deflation might not be good for you, but wouldn't deflation be pretty nice for poor and working class people if the things they bought cost less money? I mean, you would just think that would be normal. So anyway, I thought this was such a fascinating thing. And you're like, oh, wow. It's not just that it's a fascinating thing. What's really interesting is that no one talks about this. This never comes up. You never see this on a CNN panel. You know what I mean? You never, or even in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, very rarely does anyone actually look at things that way. Now, the Wall Street Journal will talk a little bit more about monetary issues, but it's very rare that they talk about that. And this was something that Ron Paul was always talking about. And I don't know, I just thought, wow, that's really interesting. Even if you have a counter opinion of why it's better to have this inflationary society, no one seems to really even be making that argument. It's just yeah, we don't find that interesting. We're not really trying to talk about that.